A young black man, intern for only 3 months at the prestigious Sterling Corporation, watched the scene from across the marble lobby as he balanced a tray of expensive coffees for executives who barely knew his name. Corporate hypocrisy shone brighter than the waxed floor. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't understand what you're trying to tell me," the receptionist said with a tone of ill-concealed irritation. The woman in the elegant suit gestured desperately, her hands dancing in the air in a language that no one there seemed to understand. Her shoulders began to slump under the familiar weight of exclusion, that silent defeat that people like her knew all too well. But when he saw that woman being treated like an inconvenience, something inside Daniel refused to accept yet another injustice, disguised as professional protocol. His feet moved before his mind could reason about the possible consequences. He approached the counter, set the tray aside, and raised his hands with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting every gesture.
"Hello, ma'am. Can I help you?"
His hands formed the words that his voice could not convey in the same way. Her face lit up, as if someone had turned on a light in a dark room. "Thank you. I thought no one here would understand me," she replied, her gestures laden with genuine relief. The entire lobby stopped. Conversation ceased. Footsteps slowed, and all eyes turned to this unexpected scene. A young black intern conversing fluently in sign language with a visitor whom the receptionist had dismissed as a problem. What Daniel didn't know was that Mrs. Charlotte Reynolds, the company's CEO, had just stepped out of the executive elevator and was witnessing every second of that interaction. Her sharp gray eyes, known for dismantling seasoned executives with a single glance, now watched with a different intensity, as if she were seeing something she had long sought without knowing. But neither Daniel nor Mrs. Reynolds could have predicted that this simple display of humanity was about to unleash the fury of someone who considered any act of kindness a personal threat to her own mediocrity. Across the lobby, Margaret, a senior manager, watched the scene with a kind of anger that only insecure people feel when they witness genuine competence. Her eyes narrowed as she calculated exactly how to turn this moment of compassion into a public lesson on knowing your place. What Margaret didn't realize was that every cruel word she was about to utter would be remembered with photographic precision by someone who had the power to completely rewrite the ending of this story. If you want to find out how a simple act of kindness can reveal people's true character and set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what happened in the next few minutes would forever change the lives of everyone involved in this story. Well, what a touching scene. Margaret's sharp voice cut through the lobby like a blade, echoing off the marble so that everyone could hear it perfectly, and in turn playing professional interpreter. How adorable! Daniel felt the blood freeze in his veins. All eyes in the lobby turned to him, including those of executives who until then had not even known of his existence. Margaret approached with calculated steps, her heels echoing like a countdown to public humiliation. "Sorry to interrupt this performance," Margaret continued, sarcasm dripping from every word. "But we have protocols in this company. Interns do not interpret for clients. That's what certified professionals are for." The deaf woman looked confused between the two people, clearly sensing the tension even without hearing the venomous words. Daniel quickly interpreted. "I apologize, ma'am. It seems I overstepped my bounds." "Exactly," Margaret smiled coldly. "Daniel, isn't it? 3 months here, and already thinking you're indispensable? How ambitious." The word ambitious came out of her mouth like an insult. Mrs. Charlotte Reynolds stood motionless near the elevators, observing every nuance of that interaction. Her experienced eyes, skilled at reading people, captured every micro-gesture, every inflection of voice, every demonstration of character being revealed under pressure. "Ma'am Margaret," Daniel tried to keep his voice steady. "I was just helping. She needed help." By a qualified professional, not an intern who decided to show off to get attention. "Do you think a few hand gestures are going to impress anyone here?" Margaret interrupted him brutally. The receptionist smiled discreetly, clearly pleased to see someone else being humiliated for failing to solve a problem she had created. Other employees began to gather, drawn to the public drama like flies to the honey of someone else's misfortune. Daniel took a deep breath, and something in his gaze changed. For a split second, Margaret might have noticed that this young man wasn't being broken by the humiliation. He was being forged by it. "I understand your concern," Daniel said, his voice taking on an unexpected serenity. "It wasn't my intention to cause trouble." "His intention?" Margaret laughed loudly. "Honey, you're a 3-month intern. His intentions are irrelevant. His job is to bring coffee, make copies, and learn to be invisible until he earns the right to have opinions." The deaf woman gently touched his arm and signaled, "You don't have to apologize for being kind. Thank you for your help." When Daniel translated her words to the audience, something interesting happened. Some faces showed genuine discomfort with Margaret's unnecessary cruelty. But Margaret didn't notice. She was too busy savoring his moment of power. "How dramatic." Margaret rolled her eyes. "Daniel, you have work to do. I suggest you return to your actual responsibilities and leave professional matters to those who really understand the subject." That's when Daniel did something no one expected. Instead of cowering or running away, he turned to the deaf woman and signaled with fluid, elegant gestures, "Ma'am, it was an honor to help you. I hope you find exactly what you're looking for at this company." The fluidity and naturalness of his movements made even Margaret stop talking for a moment. These weren't the clumsy gestures of someone who had memorized a few phrases. It was the fluent communication of someone who truly mastered that language. The woman smiled and replied in sign language, her gestures quick and expressive. Daniel laughed, a genuine warm laugh, before interpreting. She said she rarely meets someone who communicates so naturally and that she has a meeting scheduled with the CEO about an accessibility project. The silence in the lobby became almost palpable. Margaret blinked several times, slowly processing that this was not just any visitor, but someone important enough to have a direct meeting with Mrs. Charlotte Reynolds. "Well," Margaret tried to regain control of the situation, "I'm sure Mrs. Reynolds will arrange for a suitable interpreter for her meeting." Actually, a deep voice cut through the tension like an axe. "I believe I've already found the perfect interpreter." Everyone turned to see Mrs. Charlotte Reynolds approaching the group, her presence filling the space like a magnetic field. Margaret paled instantly. How much of that conversation had the CEO witnessed? "Mrs. Reynolds," Margaret stammered, "I was just explaining the company protocols for publicly humiliating an employee who has demonstrated exceptional competence and genuine kindness?" Charlotte asked, her voice calm but laden with an authority that made Margaret take a step back. Daniel remained motionless, but his eyes met Charlotte's for a brief moment. In that look, she saw something that reminded her of her own son. The same quiet determination, the same refusal to let herself be broken by small people in positions of temporary power. "Daniel," Charlotte said without taking her eyes off Margaret, "join me and Mrs. Peters for the meeting. It seems you are exactly the person we need for this project." As the three headed for the elevators, Charlotte added casually, but loud enough for the entire lobby to hear, "Margaret, see you in my office in an hour. We have a lot to talk about regarding leadership and protocols." Daniel stepped into the elevator, still processing what had just happened. But a part of him, a part that Margaret had completely underestimated, wasn't surprised at all. Because sometimes, when you grow up being underestimated because of his race, his background, his gender, you develop a special intuition. You learn to identify who really has power and who just pretends to. And you learn to wait for the right moment. What Margaret didn't know was that Daniel hadn't learned sign language by accident, nor had he developed that serenity under pressure for no reason. And she definitely didn't know that the young intern she had just tried to humiliate had spent the last few years caring for a deaf younger sister, facing exactly this kind of prejudice and discrimination every day. As the elevator doors closed, Daniel allowed himself a small but meaningful smile. Margaret had made the classic mistake of insecure people, attacking someone without first finding out who he was really up against. And that, as she would soon discover, had been a very, very costly mistake. The meeting in Mrs. Charlotte Reynolds' office lasted 2 hours and completely changed Daniel's perspective on that company. Mrs. Peters wasn't just any visitor. She was Jane Peters, founder of the largest corporate accessibility organization in the country, evaluating Sterling Corporation for a $1 million partnership. His interpretation was exceptional. Jane signaled to Daniel while Charlotte watched intently. But more importantly, you understood not only her words, but her intentions. That's rare. Daniel had interpreted faithfully, but internally, he was processing a shocking revelation. Mrs. Charlotte Reynolds spoke sign language, not fluently, but enough to follow basic conversations. She had understood every word exchanged in the lobby, including all of Margaret's insults. "Mrs. Peters is right," Charlotte said, her eyes meeting his own. "Your sister must be very proud to have a brother who masters communication in this way." Daniel stopped interpreting for a moment. How did she know about his sister, Sarah? "I did a quick search," Charlotte explained with a half smile. "Sarah, 17, captain of the deaf school's basketball team, full scholarship for graphic design. Her parents each worked 2 jobs to support the family. And you? You work part-time at a restaurant in addition to your internship here to help with the family bills." The vulnerability Daniel had carefully hidden for months was now exposed before the company's most powerful CEO. But instead of feeling embarrassed, he noticed something different in Charlotte's gaze: genuine respect. "Jane, I need to tell you something," Charlotte continued. "My son was deaf. He passed away 3 years ago in an accident, but he taught me the basics of sign language before." "Before he..." Her voice faltered briefly. "He always said that people who truly understand communication don't just translate words, they translate souls." The silence in the office was broken only by the discreet sound of Daniel interpreting Charlotte's words for Jane, who nodded with deep understanding. "That's why this project is so important to me," Charlotte continued. "It's not just about compliance or corporate image. It's about creating an environment where people like my son, like your sister, never feel invisible or overlooked." Jane turned to Daniel and signaled something that made him blush slightly. She asked if he would agree to lead the implementation of the company's accessibility program, not as an intern, as a senior consultant. "Senior consultant?" Daniel murmured, barely believing the words coming out of his own mouth. "With a corresponding salary, your own office, and the autonomy to hire a team," Charlotte added. "What do you say?" While Daniel processed the magnitude of that offer, Margaret furiously tapped away at her keyboard 3 floors below, drafting emails to every influential person she knew in the company. Her strategy was simple: destroy Daniel's credibility before he could consolidate any position. 2. Executive Board subject: concerns about improper favoritism of unqualified personnel. Margaret had decided that if she couldn't break Daniel with public humiliation, she would destroy him through an internal political war. What she didn't know was that Mrs. Charlotte Reynolds had anticipated exactly that reaction. "Daniel," Charlotte said as he was still absorbing the proposal, "I need to warn you about something. Margaret will likely try to sabotage you in the coming days. She's not the type of person to accept losing prestige quietly." "What do you mean, Mrs. Reynolds?" "She will send emails questioning your qualifications, spread rumors about favoritism, possibly even try to create embarrassing situations for you publicly. It's her standard behavior when she feels threatened." Jane interrupted with a pointed question that made Daniel smile for the first time in that conversation. "She wants to know if you are prepared for a war, and if you have your own strategies." Daniel took a deep breath before answering, and something in his tone of voice changed completely. "Mrs. Reynolds, Mrs. Peters, you assume that I am just an innocent victim in this situation. And for 3 months, I let everyone think exactly that." He stopped for a moment, making direct eye contact with Charlotte. Do you think a young black man from the suburbs can survive 3 months in a toxic corporate environment like this without developing some defensive skills? Charlotte raised an eyebrow, clearly interested. Continue. Margaret has been sending derogatory emails about me to colleagues for 2 months. She documents every hostile interaction in intimate detail. She talks about inadequate interns who should know his place in conversations she thinks are private. Daniel paused to let the information sink in. I recorded everything. The silence in the office became palpable. Jane leaned forward, clearly impressed by the revelation. Why? Charlotte asked simply. Because when you grow up being systematically underestimated, you learn that documentation is your only protection. My sister, Sarah, taught me that. She records all interactions with teachers who show prejudice against deaf students. Evidence, she always points out, is more powerful than outrage. Daniel opened his bag and took out a small digital recorder. I have 47 hours of recorded conversations, including comments about interns who don't know his place. Discussions about how people like him are hired only for superficial diversity, and at least 8 instances of Margaret instructing other employees to ignore my requests for help or information. Charlotte and Jane exchanged a look that mixed surprise with genuine admiration. Margaret makes the classic mistake of privileged people, Daniel continued, his voice maintaining that icy serenity. She assumes that people like me are too naive or intimidated to defend themselves properly. She speaks freely because she believes her position protects her from any consequences. And how do you intend to use these recordings? Charlotte asked, though she already knew the answer. I haven't decided yet, but Margaret has 72 hours to prove what kind of person she really is. If she chooses escalation, she'll find out that she seriously underestimated who she's dealing with. Jane clapped slowly, her gestures conveying total approval of the strategy. There's one more thing, Daniel added, a small but meaningful smile appearing on his lips. Margaret doesn't know that I speak 3 languages fluently, including German. She has had several very interesting conversations with German suppliers, assuming that no one around her understood what was being said. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, processing the complexity of the young man she had completely underestimated. Daniel, do you accept our offer? I accept, but on one condition. What is it? I want complete autonomy to deal with Margaret as I see fit. No interference, no micromanagement. She chooses how this ends, peacefully or as a lesson the entire company will never forget. The smile that spread across Mrs. Charlotte Reynolds' face at that moment was the same smile that had built a corporate empire. Pure recognition of her strategic mind meeting another. Jane, Charlotte said, I believe we have found exactly the right person to revolutionize our approach to corporate communications. As the hiring papers were being prepared, none of the 3 realized that Margaret had decided to accelerate her own plans. At that very moment, she was sending a message to the city's leading corporate newspaper, offering an exclusive story about racial favoritism at Sterling Corporation. What Margaret couldn't have imagined was that her declared war was about to turn into the most documented and meticulous public destruction that the corporate world had witnessed in decades. And it would all begin in less than 24 hours, when she would make the ultimate mistake of underestimating not only Daniel, but the quiet power of someone who had learned to plan his battles long before he fought them. The bomb exploded the next morning in a way Margaret could never have predicted. She had called an urgent executive board meeting to expose inappropriate hiring practices, confident that her behind-the-scenes war had undermined any credibility Daniel might have had. Gentlemen, ladies, Margaret began her presentation with a venomous smile of someone who believes they hold all the cards. I have brought you here to discuss a serious case of favoritism that jeopardizes our corporate reputation. Charlotte sat silently at the head of the table, watching Margaret with the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment. Daniel was present as a newly hired senior consultant, a title that made Margaret visibly grind her teeth. This person, Margaret pointed at Daniel without even looking him in the eye, was promoted from intern to senior consultant in less than 24 hours. No qualifications, No experience. Based purely on. Based on what, Margaret? Charlotte interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Margaret hesitated for a split second, realizing too late that she had fallen into a trap. Well, obvious favoritism. We all know that certain hires are made based on quotas, not merit. The silence in the room became palpable. Some board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Interesting, Daniel said calmly, turning on a small recorder in the center of the table. Margaret, do you mind if we play back some of her conversations about quotas and merit? Margaret's face instantly paled. That's illegal. You can't. Actually, Charlotte smiled coldly. Recordings made in common areas of the company are perfectly legal when they document systematic discrimination. Margaret's voice echoed through the room speakers. These diversity interns are all the same. Hired to fill quotas. They know nothing, and yet they think they deserve promotions. The faces around the table hardened progressively. Margaret tried to turn off the equipment, but Daniel gently pushed her hand away. We have more, Daniel continued with icy serenity. Margaret, do you remember this conversation with Robert from HR about people like me? New recording. People like him need to learn to stay in their place. No matter how many nice gestures he makes, an intern is an intern. Especially those who come from, you know, where. Margaret stood up abruptly, her voice rising an octave. That's out of context. You're distorting. Context? Daniel repeated thoughtfully. You're right. Let's give full context. The meeting room screen lit up, displaying a detailed spreadsheet. 47 hours of recordings over 2 months. 23 discriminatory comments based on race. 31 derogatory references about people who don't know his place. And my favorite, new recording. Margaret laughing with colleagues about how the little black security guard had been promoted to making coffee. I never, Margaret stammered, but her own voice contradicted her. Margaret. Charlotte rose slowly, her authority filling the room. In 20 years of running this company, I have never witnessed such a systematic display of toxicity and discrimination. Charlotte, you can't believe him. It's a setup. What? Jane Peters entered the room at that exact moment, accompanied by 2 reporters and a camera. Sorry to interrupt, but when I heard there would be a discussion about discrimination at Sterling Corporation, I thought it important to document it for our corporate accessibility project. Margaret immediately realized she had fallen into the perfect trap. Not only was her career destroyed, her destruction was being broadcast live to the largest corporate inclusion project in the country. Margaret, Charlotte pronounced each word with surgical precision. You are terminated for cause. Security will accompany you to clear your desk. And Margaret, she paused, her eyes meeting her one last time. I strongly recommend you seek legal counsel. Daniel has sufficient documentation for a discrimination lawsuit that will destroy any chance of you working in corporate communications again. As Margaret was escorted out, her protests echoing down the hallway, Daniel remained calmly seated. There was no petty triumph in his face, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who had executed justice with surgical precision. Jane applauded slowly. Impressive. You documented systematic discrimination, exposed corporate toxicity, and turned your own humiliation into the ultimate downfall of those who attacked you. Charlotte nodded with genuine approval. Daniel, you just gave our entire industry a masterclass on how to combat prejudice with strategic intelligence. But the real twist was yet to come, because Margaret didn't know that Daniel had sent copies of all the recordings to the city's leading corporate newspaper, the same newspaper Margaret had contacted to expose the alleged favoritism. The afternoon edition's headline would not only destroy Margaret, but serve as an example to every toxic executive who underestimated people who were different. Executive fired for systematic discrimination. Recordings revealed. 2 months of racist comments at major corporation. The war was over before Margaret even realized she was fighting someone infinitely more prepared, strategic, and intelligent than her arrogance had allowed her to recognize. 6 months later, the headline that destroyed Margaret still echoed through the corporate world as a grim warning. Former executive sued for systematic discrimination, loses everything in million-dollar court battle. Margaret had desperately tried to rebuild her career, but she quickly discovered that a reputation destroyed by irrefutable evidence offers no second chances. No reputable company would risk hiring someone whose discriminatory recordings had become a case study in business ethics courses. Her penthouse apartment was sold to pay lawyers. Her elite social circle evaporated the moment her toxicity became public. Her corporate connections cut off contact as if she were radioactive. Meanwhile, Daniel had become the most sought-after accessibility consultant in the country. His department at Sterling Corporation had expanded into an entire division, generating millions in contracts and positioning the company as a national leader in corporate inclusion. "Daniel," Charlotte said during the quarterly board meeting, "his division has increased our revenue by 340% this year. More importantly, we have completely changed our corporate culture." Jane Peters, now an official partner in a nationwide project, proudly pointed out, "You didn't just create a program. You created a movement. Companies across the country are copying his model." Sarah, now 18, regularly visited her brother's office, an office with a panoramic view of the city, where a gold plaque on the door read, "Daniel Williams, Executive Director of Accessibility and Inclusion." "Do you remember when I said that one day he would see?" Sarah signaled with a beaming smile. "You didn't just prove your worth. You redefined what worth means." Daniel's transformation transcended numbers and titles. He had become a national voice at corporate conferences. His TEDx talks on turning discrimination into opportunity racked up millions of views, and universities vied for his presence as a speaker. Mr. Peterson, promoted to security coordinator after years of exemplary service, watched the lobby where it all began every day. "Mr. Daniel changed this company," he would tell new employees. But more than that, he proved that strategic kindness is more powerful than mindless cruelty. Sterling Corporation had become a national benchmark. Daniel's accessibility program was studied at Harvard. His inclusion protocols were adopted by Fortune 500 corporations, and the company received international awards for social responsibility. Margaret, meanwhile, had moved to a small town where no one knew her story. She worked at a local accounting firm for a salary that barely covered the rent on a modest apartment, a dizzying fall for someone who had once commanded entire departments. Occasionally, Margaret would search for Daniel's name online and find new evidence of his meteoric success. Another award, another accolade, another headline celebrating the man she had tried to destroy. What gnawed at Margaret most was not just her own downfall. It was the belated realization that Daniel had always been exactly what he claimed to be: genuinely talented, strategically brilliant, and morally superior. Her attempt at humiliation had only revealed her own mediocrity. Mrs. Charlotte Reynolds, transformed by the experience, had instituted the Charles Program, named in honor of her son, offering full scholarships to young people from marginalized communities interested in communication and accessibility. Daniel personally oversaw each application. "Do you know what I've learned?" Charlotte said to Daniel during a private conversation. "My son did not die in vain if his story helped me recognize genuine talent when I finally found it." The company had become a magnet for diverse talent, not because of quotas or external pressures, but because Daniel had proven that real inclusion generates extraordinary results. Professionals from all backgrounds competed for positions in a corporation that truly valued merit combined with character. Sarah graduated as the top student in her class in graphic design and was immediately hired by Sterling's marketing division. On her first day at work, she signaled to Daniel, "Now we're officially co-workers." Daniel's revenge had transcended personal punishment. It had become a systemic revolution. He hadn't just taken down a toxic person. He had built a model of how organizations can thrive when they genuinely embrace diversity. Margaret had tried to reduce Daniel to stereotypes and limitations. In response, Daniel had become a transformative force that redefined entire industry standards. The inappropriate intern now led changes that impacted thousands of lives. The lesson was crystal clear. When you try to destroy someone out of prejudice, you're not only revealing your own flawed character, you are potentially creating the catalyst for your own replacement by someone infinitely better. Daniel Williams proved that the best revenge is not to repay cruelty with cruelty, but to turn discrimination into fuel for such absolute success that it renders any future attempts at minimization irrelevant. If this story of transformation and justice touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that our origins never define our destiny, only our determination to turn obstacles into extraordinary opportunities.